Hello, welcome to the Wire Podcast, a podcast that provides the best content about all things sports. I'm Ryan McCrary, and on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the NFL Draft. Over the last couple of months, I've done a lot of work gathering data and stats for all of the prospects, not only in this year's draft, but in every draft going back to 2017, and I've been using this data to compare prospects to see where this year's class stacks historically, and I've also built models for every single position, and basically trying to predict how successful each prospect will be in the NFL. And I want to go over the results of those models for each position today. I'm gonna be going through each position from quarterbacks all the way to safeties. That's what we're gonna be doing on today's episode. I'm super excited to present this project to y'all and for y'all to see these results. I hope you're excited as well. Let's not waste any more time and dive right in. Alright, let's get the show on the road, and like I said in the intro, today I'm going to be showing y'all the results of all the work I've been doing over the last couple of months, building prospect models for the NFL Draft. All the data that I have in my database, it includes prospects going back to 2017, it includes career production. It also includes combine testing, athletic testing, whether it be from the NFL Combine or Pro Days. It also includes things like consensus rankings, which I got from NFL Mock Draft Database, and also Draft Capital. And it uses all of this to try to predict how successful each prospect will be in the NFL. And the way I use that is by correlating all of these different metrics to approximate value, which is a metric from ProFootballReference.com. And approximate value gives a single number value to each individual season throughout the entirety of NFL history, which allows us to compare individual seasons across eras. It also allows us to compare different players' careers. Now, approximate value isn't perfect. These models are not perfect. They're not a super precise measurement of a player's impact and a player's success in the NFL. Sometimes it weights things more than I would like, and so it isn't perfect, and I fully admit that. But I do think the results are very solid. And one more thing I should clarify is that when I use approximate value, I use a player's approximate value through their first 4 seasons in the NFL. That's the duration of their rookie contract. The reason I do 4 instead of 5 is that if you are picked outside of the first round, you aren't guaranteed 5 years. You can first round picks, they're guaranteed 5 years on their first contract. That's not the case for rookies drafted outside the first round. That's why I chose years 1 through 4 for that. And approximate value is cumulative. So it's basically a measure of each prospect's cumulative value through the first 4 seasons of their career. Now that I've gone through everything that is included in the models for each position, let's start off by looking at the quarterbacks and see how my model likes this year's quarterback class. So let's go ahead and pull this up. Let me go ahead and pull up the model results for this year's quarterback class. I got it pulled up here. So for my quarterback model, it looks at career production, it looks at passing production, rushing production, as well as athleticism, and draft capital and consensus rankings. It values rushing a lot, as well as athleticism. And for quarterbacks, I don't have a ton of data that the model is trained on, and so some of the results might be a little bit wonky, a little bit weird. And this model should improve as we get more data over the next couple of years. And something I am thinking about doing for next year's draft is possibly replacing approximate value with PFF grade, looking at each player's PFF grade through the first 4 seasons of their career. That's something I'm considering, so that would change the model moving forward. But for now, we're using approximate value. And we can go ahead and look at the results of my quarterback model for this year's class. So number one is Caleb Williams, which should be no surprise. He has a pre-draft score of 100, and by pre-draft score, this is my model that looks at consensus rankings instead of draft capital, and it only looks at consensus rankings along with production, athleticism, stuff like that. The post-draft model, which I will have available for these prospects after the draft, that will include draft capital instead of consensus rankings. So Caleb Williams ranks number one in my pre-draft model with a score of 100. He actually ranks number one in my database for all quarterbacks going back to 2017. My model likes him a lot, and for good reason. His production profile is really, really strong. He's a great passer, underrated as a runner, and I think he does a lot of things at a very high level as a passer. He's also a solid athlete, and he's projected to go number one overall, so it's very easy to see why he scored so well in my model. Number two is Drake May with a score of 99. He is actually second behind Caleb Williams all time in my model. My model loves him a lot. He has a very high passing score, as well as a very high rushing score, while also, like Caleb, being a pretty good athlete, and he's projected to go very high in the draft, and I believe that his consensus ranking is second. Yes, it is. And I will say, just for clarity, these consensus rankings are about a week old. I will update them the day of the draft, and I'll probably tweet the results of my model. But yeah, so right now, Drake May ranks second in my pre-draft model for this year's quarterback class. My model likes him a lot. Another thing to know, he is one of the best deep ball throwers that we've seen in recent memory. His deep ball passing is exceptional. He does have a few warts in his production profile. His pressure to sack rate is a little high, and he does scramble. He does leave the pocket more than I would like, but still, he is a very good prospect. And by my model, he is a historically great prospect. Next up at QB3, we have J.J. McCarthy. He's a young guy who is just very productive as a passer. Also was fairly productive as a runner, and is just a very solid athlete. His production profile is just really strong. He doesn't have elite production in some areas that would hint at high upside. For example, he doesn't push the ball down the field at an elite level. He also doesn't have a great rushing production. He's fairly productive as a runner, but he doesn't have elite rushing production like a guy that we're about to talk about in a second, who you probably know who I'm referencing, or Drake May or Caleb Williams. But still, my model likes him a lot. He's probably going to get top 10 draft capital. He's top 10 in consensus rankings. So it's very easy to see why my pre-draft model likes him so much. And I don't know if I said his score. My model gave him a score of 88, which is a very good mark. And I don't know off the top of my head, but I do believe he is, if he isn't top 10, he is very close to being top 10 all time in my model. Next up, we have Jaden Daniels with a score of 84, which is really good. I have some issues with his profile. His passing score was below average, but he's one of the more productive rushing quarterbacks in my database. He's also a great athlete, and he is projected to go very high in the draft. He is likely going to be the second overall pick, and because of all that, my model likes him a lot. He's also very high in the consensus rankings, and because he is such a good runner and such a good athlete, and is very high in the consensus rankings, my model likes him a lot. His passing production, being below average, does drag him down. That's why his pre-draft score is only 84. I know I'm very low on Jaden Daniels. I've said that on Twitter a lot, so if you follow me on there, you know my thoughts about Jaden Daniels. But my model likes him a good bit, views him as a pretty good prospect. But of course, I have some concerns about him, but my model does like him a good bit. Next up, we have Michael Penix Jr. at number 5 with a score of 64. So we've got a pretty big drop-off here. His passing score is pretty good. He also tested very well at his pro day. If you don't want to care about that too much, you might have a lower opinion of him than my model does. His passing production is pretty good. He pushes the ball down the field. I do have some concerns about his lack of mobility and his, subpar accuracy, but he is an aggressive downfield thrower. He also avoids sacks at a very high level, and his production profile is very solid. It's very solid. I just don't think he has a ton of upside, and I do think that is less than stellar accuracy is a big problem considering that he has a ton of experience and is an older prospect who is a pocket passer. I just don't think I would be less concerned about his accuracy if he were a lot younger, had a lot less experience, and or were a lot more mobile and had a lot better production in areas that would hint at very high upside. I just don't think he does, and so I'm a bit lower on him, as is my model. I don't want to go through a ton of other quarterbacks. I will bring up some names for quarterbacks my model likes, and some names some guys that are big names in the draft, like Bo Nix. My model gave him a score of 40. His passing and rushing numbers were a bit low by my model, which was interesting to see. I actually like Bo Nix a decent amount. I don't think he's a first round pick, I don't think he's a first round caliber player or anything. But I do think he can have a role in the NFL, even if he is just a backup for most of his career. He also has decent rushing numbers. I'm not really sure why my model doesn't love him. A few guys that my model likes more than him are Jordan Travis, John Reese Plumlee, and Michael Pratt. At the beginning, or near the beginning of this podcast, I mentioned that the results can sometimes be a bit weird. This is a spot where the rankings are a little bit weird. Jordan Travis and John Reese Plumlee rank very high in my model, simply because they're very, very good runners, and approximate value cares about that, so my model cares about that. No, that's all I'm going to talk about for the quarterbacks. I guess I'll mention some other names, like Spencer Rattler has a score of 30, and Joe Milton has a score of 21. My model just doesn't like those guys very much at all, and I would tend to agree with that. I don't really like those guys much either. Now we can move on to the running backs and talk about the running backs for this year's class. For the running back model, it looks at rushing production, receiving production, and pass blocking, and also, looks at athleticism and everything else. There's a narrative that this year's running back class is weak. My model doesn't really agree. I can see why people feel that way, but my model actually does like this running back class a good amount. It really likes Jonathan Brooks. It gave him a pre-draft score of 98, which is really, really good. That's a phenomenal mark. Something that that is like a big weakness with my running back model is that it doesn't account for the fact that Jonathan Brooks really only had one season of production, because I try to factor in games played for running backs, and with running backs, playing a lot of games is actually bad for their projection. And so it is kind of hard for me to factor in for my model that he only played for one season. I think for me, that's something that I have to consider. My model also doesn't know that he just tore his ACL. And so keep that in mind when you think about his pre-draft score in my model. But Jonathan Brooks has a great all-around profile. He's really, really good, was really productive as a runner, as a receiver, and as a pass blocker. And because of that, and because he does have fairly good, his consensus ranking is solid. He is ranking really high in my pre-draft model. I know a lot of people are a little bit lower on him, as well as the entire running back class, but my model absolutely loves him, and I think he's a pretty good prospect myself. At running back 2, we have Trey Benson with a score of 89. My model likes him a lot, views him as a great running back prospect. And I'll see, so my running back model breaks it up into like rushing, receiving, pass blocking, and then we have athleticism. Trey Benson's rushing score and pass blocking score were both really good. He also tested well at the combine, and so his rushing score was elite, and his pass blocking score was good. And he also is projected, or like his consensus ranking is 60, which allowed him to score pretty well in my model. Next up, we have Bucky Irving with a pre-draft score of 85. My model likes him. I know some people were really low on him after his combine performance, which was really bad, but his rushing and receiving numbers were really good. Like, they were great, according to my model. His pass blocking was below average, and his athleticism was quite poor, but he was very productive in college. You'll just have to decide how much you care about, his weight, his athletic testing, and things like that. But my model likes him enough to rank him as RB3. Next up at RB4, we have Audric Estime with a score of 76. My model likes him a good bit. And then at number 5, we have Blake Corum with a score of 70. And those are the top 5 running backs by my model. Audric Estime scored very well as a runner with a rushing score of 93, which is great. Didn't really score that well as a receiver or a pass blocker, and his athleticism was a bit low. But I know his consensus ranking was solid, I believe. Just outside the top 100. But his production score was pretty good because my model does care about rushing a good bit. His production score was pretty good. Blake Corum, I don't think there's a ton to like about Blake Corum's profile. I know my model likes him. I think his consensus ranking is doing a lot of the heavy work here. He's just a bit average to a little bit above average in a lot of categories by my model. Some other guys that my model likes is Isaiah Davis, who has a score of 69. Kamani Vidal from Troy with a score of 57. Jalen Wright with a score of 55. And then you got Frank Gore Jr. with a score of 55, and Carson Steele with a score of 50. And some guys my model is really low on include Braylon Allen, who has a score of 39, and Marshawn Lloyd, who has a score of 35. And another guy who has gotten some love on social media later in the draft process, Will Shipley. My model is a bit low on him, gave him a score of 36. Alright, those are my model's thoughts on this year's running back class. I think the running back class is a little bit underrated, and I think the top of the running back class is better than people think, but I do see some of the issues with this year's running back class that a lot of other people see. Alright, let's go ahead and move on and talk about the receivers. Let's talk about the receivers in this year's class. So let me go ahead and pull up this year's class in my model. Let's go. All right. So number one in my model's receiving rankings for this year's class, we got Marvin Harrison Jr. with a pre-draft score of 100. He ranks number 1 in my receiver model going back to 2017. He's awesome. There's a lot to love about his profile. I will say for Marvin Harrison Jr., I tried to find some athletic testing numbers for him online. And I did find some, and I used those numbers to come up with a relative athletic score. Relative athletic score measures prospects' athletic testing numbers on a scale of 1 to 10. Kentley Platt did some great work on Twitter there with his website, and his RES score was awesome, like one of the best in the class. It was very good, and because of that, because his production profile was so strong, because his athletic testing was great by the numbers that I found, and because his consensus ranking is so high, he did have the best score in my database for all receivers going back over the last 7 drafts. Number 2, we have Malik Neighbors with a score of 98. My model likes him a good bit. Very productive, very athletic. also going to have, his consensus ranking is really high, and he's probably going to get great draft capital. Next up at number 3, we have Rome Odunze with a score of 96, and I believe that Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, and Rome Odunze are top 10 among all receivers going back to 2017 in my database, in my pre-draft score, which is really impressive. Rome Odunze doesn't have as strong of a production profile as Harrison Jr., or Neighbors, but still, he's got a great all-around profile, and my model likes him a lot. At number 4, we have Ladd McConkey with a score of 87, and at number 5, we have Troy Franklin with a score of 85. Those guys had very good production profiles. Their consensus rankings were pretty good. They're both top 40. And then I know Ladd McConkey, I think both of them had pretty good RES scores in the 9s, which is great to see. So it's easy to see why my model likes them a lot. After them, there are a good amount of receivers who ranked in the 50th percentile or above. That includes Malachi Corley and Brian Thomas Jr., who Corley has a score of 71. Brian Thomas Jr. has a score of 70. You got Xavier Worthy, Kenyon Coleman. Those two guys have a score of 65 and 64, respectively. Then you have Adonai Mitchell with a score of 59. Johnny Wilson with a score of 57. Roman Wilson with a score of 56, Devontae Walker with a score of 54, and Jalen McMillan with a score of 51. Alright, so those are my model's thoughts on this year's receiver class. The receiver class is pretty good, especially at the top. A lot of these guys don't have great production profiles, but a lot of these guys are also young and athletic and have really good consensus rankings. And so my model likes them a decent amount anyway, but it'll be very interesting to see how all of these guys work out in the NFL. Now we can move on and talk about the tight ends. So let me go ahead and pull up the tight end class and see where it ranks in my model. Let me pull that up real quick. Alright, here we go. So tight end 1 by my model, no surprise, Brock Bowers. He's got an elite production profile. He's a very good athlete. He also ranks really high in the consensus rankings, and so he has a score of 99. Next, at tight end 2, we got Ben Sinnott with a score of 73. My model likes him a good bit. And for tight ends, my model is broken up into receiving, pass blocking, run blocking, and athleticism. And on top of that, you have like the consensus rankings and the draft capital. And I know I didn't go through that for receivers. For receivers, the model is broken up into, or the production part of the model is broken up into receiving and run blocking. That's for receivers. Brock Bowers scored really well in pretty much every area, especially in terms of production. He didn't test at the Combine or his Pro Day, and so I got his athletic score from NFL.com. Part of their next-gen stats model, they have an athletic score or an athleticism score, and so I used that for him. Wasn't great there, but when you watch him play, it's pretty clear that he's a great athlete, and even though his athleticism score is just average, my model still likes him a lot. For Ben Sinnott, he was just average as a receiver, and his blocking numbers weren't great, but he was very athletic. Like, his athletic testing was great. He also has a good consensus ranking, just outside the top 100, and because of that, he was able to score high. And for tight ends, my model cares a lot about blocking. It also cares a lot about receiving, and then it cares a lot about athleticism, and so that's why Ben Sinnott was able to have a score of 73. We have a few guys who are in the 60s. Jatavion Sanders is tight end 3 by my model with a score of 69. And Cade Stover is tight end 4 by my model with a score of 65. Then we've got two guys with scores in the 50s. Theo Johnson with a score of 59, and Jared Wiley from TCU with a score of 57. One guy that my model is very low on is Jaheim Bell. His receiving production was awesome, but there are a lot of questions when it comes to his profile. Like, his size is a concern. His blocking numbers were really, really bad, like very poor. He's a great pass catcher, but just the athletic score was just average, and the blocking production was a bit worrisome. And then for Theo Johnson, his receiving production was a little bit below average, but his pass blocking numbers were great, and he is a freak athlete, like a historically good athlete for the tight end position, and so my model liked him a decent amount. Those are my model's thoughts on the tight end position. Now we can move on and look at the interior offensive line. And before I fully move on to the interior offensive lineman, I do want to say Brock Bowers is, I believe, top 3 all-time in my model for tight ends, which is very impressive. And I believe he is very well worth a high first-round selection. Alright, let's look at the interior offensive lineman in this year's draft. My model loves the interior offensive line class. I did put Graham Barton in with the interior offensive lineman, so he's here in this group. The number 1 interior offensive lineman in this year's draft by my model is Jackson Powers Johnson with a pre-draft score of 99. Tested well across the board. The production part of my model for interior offensive linemen is broken down into run blocking and pass blocking, and then you also have athleticism on top of everything else. He had a 100th percentile pass blocking score and a 90th percentile run blocking score, as well as a 78th percentile athleticism score. And I was able to find athletic testing for him online. Obviously, those numbers are like unofficial technically, but his RAS score using those numbers was very good. And so he tested very well as an athlete. His consensus ranking is really good. He is likely going to be drafted at first round, I think. I expect that. And it's easy to see why he ranked so high in my pre-draft model. At number 2, we have Graham Barton with a score of 88. He tested better as an interior offensive lineman than as a tackle. He's a good run blocker. He's a solid athlete, I believe. Yeah, like he's a very good athlete, an above-average run blocker, and his consensus ranking was also very good. And so he tested, or he scored like a great prospect by my model. Next up, we got Cooper Beebe from Kansas State with a score of 83. My model likes him a lot. He's really good by my model, and I'm looking at his production real quick. He's about average as a run blocker, he's actually above average as a run blocker, good as a pass blocker, and he's a good athlete. He's got a very good all-around profile. His consensus ranking is a good bit lower than both JPJ and Graham Barton. That's why his model score is a bit lower than those guys, but still, he's a great prospect. And according to my model and his production, he is probably one of the more underrated prospects in this year's draft, in my opinion. Alright, let's run through the other guys quickly here. We've got a couple of guys whose scores are in the 70s. You have Zach Frazier from West Virginia with a score of 74. You have Christian Mahogany from Boston College with a score of 73. And you have Mason McCormick from South Dakota State with a score of 71. And then you've got some guys in the 60s, Christian Haynes with a score of 66, and Bo Limmer with a score of 64. And then you've got a lot of guys in the 50s, like Tanner Bortolini with a score of 58, Dominic Pooney with a score of 56, Cedric Van Pran with a score of 54, and Matt Lee with a score of 50. And so, by my model, there are 12 interior offensive linemen with a score of 50 and above in my pre-draft model. Alright, let's close out talking about the offensive prospects in this year's draft by talking about the offensive tackles. So let me go ahead and pull up my model here for this year's tackle class. It's actually already pulled up. Number 1, the OT1 by my model in the 2024 NFL Draft is Joe Alt. No surprise there. He has a score of 100 in my pre-draft model, which is number 1 all-time. He's an awesome prospect. He scores very highly in pretty much every area. His pass blocking score was 95, his run blocking score was 99, and his athleticism score was 96. He's also expected to be drafted inside the top 10. He's young, just an excellent profile, elite profile, In my opinion, he is a blue chip prospect and is worth a very high pick in this year's draft. And for the production portion of the tackle model, it's very similar to the interior offensive lineman, just with different weights for run blocking and pass blocking, but it's split up in the same way. Like there's pass blocking and a run blocking score for tackles, just like there is for interior offensive linemen. At number 2, tackle 2, we have Talise Fuaga with a score of 97. Again, another elite prospect. I know there's a lot of talk about Fuaga moving to guard. He's a tackle, man. Like, I don't know what to tell you. His production is awesome at tackle. His pass blocking score is 93. His run blocking score is 85. And his athleticism score is 81, which is very good. He's not quite as good as Joe Alt, but he is very good. And in my opinion, he is worth a top 10 selection. And he is a tackle. He's awesome. I love him. At number 3, we have Amarius Mims with a score of 82. And I will say for tackles, my model cares a lot about run blocking for tackles. It weights that a lot. Probably more than I would. And so my rankings would look a little bit different than my model's rankings. But my model for tackles also cares a lot about pass blocking. And it cares a decent amount about athleticism. And I know I didn't mention this part for interior offensive linemen. For interior offensive linemen, my model cares a lot about pass blocking and run blocking, but it weights pass blocking a bit more, and it also cares about athleticism more for interior offensive linemen than it does for tackles. Wanted to get that out of the way because I know I forgot to mention that. Now we can move along with the tackle scores. So Amarius Mims, he has a score of 82 in my pre-draft model, which is great. His profile is awesome. He produced very well as a pass blocker. His pass blocking score is 94. His run blocking score is 69, which are both very good. And his athleticism score is 80. So he's got a very good profile. I know he's a bit inexperienced relative to other tackles in the class, but still, he's very productive, very athletic, and he's got great size. After him, we got J.C. Latham with a score of 81. And I'm going to look at his profile from a production standpoint. He has a pass blocking score of 83, a run blocking score of 71, but his athleticism score is a bit below average, around average, with a score of 47 there, but still good prospect with a score of 81. My model likes him a good bit. And then we got 2 guys who are in the 70s here. Olu Fashanu from Penn State has a score of 72, mainly because his run blocking score was really low, but he has a historically great pass blocking score. He's also a good athlete with great size. I like him a lot, and I would actually probably rank him a little bit higher than this, but still a great prospect. I like him a lot. Then we have Troy Fontenot from Washington with a score of 71. My model likes him a good bit. Doesn't have a great all-around profile, but he did produce at an above-average level in a lot of areas, and he also has a pretty high consensus ranking at 19, which is very good. My model likes him. Next up, we have Javon Foster with a score of 66. And then we got a couple of guys in the 50s, like I'm gonna screw up this guy's name. I think Kyron Amegadahi from Yale with a score of 54. I apologize for mispronouncing his name. And then we have Patrick Paul with a score of 51. And then at number 10, we have Tyler Guyton with a score of 47. And another guy that a lot of people like, Roger Rosengarten from Washington with a score of 46. Those are my prospects' thoughts on this year's tackle class, and pretty much every offensive position here. Before I move on and talk about the defensive players in this year's draft, I'm going to take a quick break, and I will be right back in just a second. Alright, I am back. Now we can talk about the defensive positions from interior defensive linemen all the way to safeties. Starting out with the interior defensive lineman. The number one defensive tackle in the 2024 NFL Draft by my model is Byron Murphy II with a pre-draft score of 93. He's an amazing pass rusher, a freak athlete, and an above-average run defender and tackler. And the production score for my model for interior defensive lineman is broken up into a pass rush score, a run defense score, and a tackle score. And so he produced fairly well in all areas. He's a great prospect, one of the better interior defensive line prospects we've seen over the last couple of years, according to my model. And number 2, we have Chris Jenkins with a score of 88, a phenomenal run defender and tackler. And also, I believe he also tested pretty well athletically. He did, with an athleticism score of 75. His pass rush production was a bit underwhelming, not great, but his run defense was spectacular. Awesome. And he also ranks 50th in the consensus rankings, which is why he scored so well in my pre-draft model. If he were higher in the consensus rankings, my model would like him even more, but for now, he has a score of 88. At number 3, we have Devontae Sweat with a score of 76. This does not factor in that he just recently got arrested due to a DWI. That is something you would have to account for subjectively. But my model likes him a good bit just based on purely production. He produced well as a run defender. He was above average as a tackler, and he was a little bit above average as a pass rusher, but the athleticism is what holds him back a little bit in terms of production, but still, he had a very solid profile. Then at number 4, we have Jer'Zhan Newton with a score of 73. My model didn't love him. It views him as an above average prospect in terms of like production and athleticism, and of course, he has a very good consensus ranking, which helps him out a lot in terms of the pre-draft score, but his production in college it wasn't great. It was solid, but wasn't amazing, and that's why his score is a bit lower than you might expect. Then at number 5, we have Braden Fisk with a score of 72, and then to round out all the guys with a score in the 70s for interior defensive linemen, we have Michael Hall Jr. So there's a lot of guys that my model likes a good bit, and a lot of guys that have scores that are 70 plus, which is good to see. You like that. And then there are a couple guys who are in the 60s, like Tyler Davis and Rook Orororo. I can't say that name. I'm terrible with names. I apologize. Both Davis has a score of 65, and Rook has a score of 61. And then there's one guy with a score in the 50s, and that's Christian Boyd from Northern Iowa with a score of 53. If he tested better, he could have actually graded very well in my model, but the athletic testing was just not great, and then his consensus ranking is pretty low, and that hurt him a lot as well. So he fell in at number 9 in my interior defensive line rankings. Now we can move on to edge, and my edge model I don't love. I'm gonna be honest. I don't love my edge model. It weights run defense and tackling way too much, in my opinion. And this is edge and a few other positions are a big reason why I am considering changing the target metric for my model from approximate value to PFF grade, because approximate value is not very precise. Is not a very precise measure of a player's individual skill set. And that really shows up with the edge rankings, and you'll see what I mean when I show you the edge rankings. So let me pull up the pre-draft scores for this year's edge class. At number 1, we have Leatu Latu, which is good, but his pre-draft score is only 80, which is a bit interesting when you look at his production. And the fact that his consensus ranking is top 20, you would think that he would have a way higher pre-draft score. but the production part of the model is split up into run defense, tackling, and pass rush. And he just didn't score that well as a run defender or a tackler. His run defense score is 44, which is a little bit below average, and then his tackling score is 15, which is quite poor. But his pass rushing score is 98. He is historically good as a pass rusher. He's also a very good athlete with an athleticism score of 71, which is great to see. You combine all that with the fact that his consensus ranking is top 20, and you have a pretty good prospect. Now, I don't love Latu as much as some analytically minded draft analysts do, but I do think he is an awesome prospect and way better than this pre-draft score. And the reason why his pre-draft score in my model is a bit low is because he just didn't score that well as a run defender and a tackler. At number 2, we have two guys tied with the same score. We got Jared Verse and, surprisingly, Chris Braswell. Jared Verse is a very good prospect. I like him a good bit. He tested below average as a run defender and poor as a tackler, just like Latu. But he's also elite as a pass rusher, and his athleticism score is actually higher than Latu's. And then Chris Braswell was around average as a run defender, but great as a tackler and great as a pass rusher, while being just around average in terms of athleticism. And then his consensus ranking is solid. It's top 50. It's not top 20 like Latu and Verse, but it's top 50, which is good. And then at number 4, we have Chop Robinson with a score of 76. He's a pass rush specialist. Tested well, or scored well as a pass rusher, but his run defense and tackling are both quite poor. But his pass rushing score is 89, and his athleticism score is 86. And he's also a young prospect with a strong consensus ranking, and so his score ended up being a 76. I would probably rank him higher than that and score him higher than that, but I know my model cares a lot about run defense and tackling. At number 5, we have Austin Booker, and number 6, we have Marshawn Kneeland. Let's look at those guys' production scores and see why my model likes them so much. For Austin Booker, he scored really well as a run defender. His run defense score was 86, his tackling score was 53, and his pass rushing score was 80. He isn't a great athlete. His athleticism score is 28, and I think his consensus ranking is a little low, like low in terms of not being elite. It's 86, so that could be better. And for Marshawn Kneeland, let's look at his production profile. So he was great as a run defender and above average as a tackler. Not great in terms of pass rush. His pass rush score was only 30, but he was above average in terms of athletic testing with a score of 64. One guy that my model is lower on than the consensus is Dallas Turner. He has a score of 67, which is above average. And when you look deeper into his numbers, I came away liking him more than my model does. The main reason why he scored a little bit low is because his run defense score was bad at 26, his tackling score was just around average at 49, and his pass rushing score was good at 70, but it wasn't elite, and his athletic testing score was just 59. Now, I have weight and height adjusted athletic testing scores, and by those numbers, he is an elite athlete. He is a bit undersized though, but in the right system, in the right scheme, his size won't be as big of a deal. He's also a very young player. I like Dallas Turner. I would take him in the first round, but I don't like him as much as Latu, Verse, and Chop Robinson. And I do think you can make a case that Chris Braswell is better, but still he's a good prospect. And I think he has a very strong case for edge 4. I just don't, and maybe edge 3. I just don't like him above Latu or Verse. I think the highest I could go is edge 3, but I do disagree with my model's ranking, having him as edge 7 in this year's draft. And that's something that I disagree with, but that's the way my model works. And then we do have one guy in the 50s, and that's Gabriel Murphy from UCLA, a very productive pass rusher, a good athlete as well. My model likes him. He's a very interesting prospect. And there are a few guys that tested really well as pass rushers that are a bit underrated by my model, in my opinion. And that includes Muhammad Kamara and Javon Solomon. Both of those guys are great pass rushers, so watch out for those guys. And then Braylon Trice is another guy who is a good pass rusher, but I'm pretty sure that his run defense and tackling scores were pretty bad. Yeah, they were awful. Like, just being flat out honest. And his athleticism score was also bad. Not poor, but bad. But yeah, those are my model's thoughts on about this edge class. I don't love the edge class. I think it's solid. I don't love it. And my model agrees, but my model is lower on the edge class than I am. So yeah, I would disagree about the edge class. I would disagree with my model about the edge class and about ranking edges in general. My model just has a different philosophy than I do. Alright, let's move on and talk about linebackers. Now, my model loves 2 linebackers in this year's draft. Number 1, we got Adrian Cooper with a pre-draft score of 96. And for linebackers, the production is split up into run defense, pass rush, and coverage. You might be wondering why tackling isn't there. The tackling production just didn't really correlate. The correlation wasn't strong enough, so I didn't include it in there. But my production model for the linebackers does include run defense, pass rush, and coverage. And then we have an athleticism score. For Adrian Cooper, his run defense score was 53, which is average, but his pass rush score was 98, his coverage score was 90, and his athleticism score was 71, which helped him out a lot. That's why he scored so highly, and he ranks top 50 in the consensus rankings. So it's pretty easy to see why my model likes him so much. He produced fairly well in pretty much every area. He's also a good athlete with a very solid consensus ranking. And number 2, we have Jeremiah Trotter Jr. with a score of 90. The reason why he ranks so high is because, let me go find his production. He had an above-average run defense score at 68, a good pass rush score at 76, a great coverage score at 88. He wasn't a great athlete. His athleticism score is just 21, and he also is a bit lower in the consensus rankings than Cooper. His consensus ranking is 81, but the production was so strong for him that my model likes him a lot. Next up, we got a big drop-off to the next guy, who is Junior Colson at 78. A good score there for him. My model likes him a good amount. And for him, I'm looking to see if his production was had any bright spots. Not really. I mean, it's just average to a little bit below average in pretty much every area. But he wasn't poor anywhere, which kind of helped him a good bit. He also ranks near the top 50 in the consensus rankings, and that was good enough for him to have a pretty good pre-draft score. We got a lot of guys in the 60s. Cedric Gray has a score of 68. Inufuan Ulofushio has a score of 68. And then, he has a score of 65. Cedric Gray has a score of 68. I think I misspoke there. Peyton Wilson has a score of 64. Trevin Wallace has a score of 63. And then we have one guy in the 50s. That is Jordan McGee with a score of 56. My model loves the top of the linebacker class, but doesn't think it has a ton of depth. It likes the linebacker class, but it doesn't love it. Views it as like a two linebacker class with some guys that are solid but not great. All right, now we can move on and talk about the cornerbacks in this year's draft. Now for the cornerback group, my model for the production portion of it, it only looks at coverage. I looked at all sorts of production from coverage to tackling and run defense, and the only thing that correlated to approximate value strong enough to be included in this model were coverage stats. And so this model is only judging these quarterback prospects using coverage production, as well as like athleticism and consensus rankings. But when you look at the production, all that it's looking at is coverage stats. Now, obviously, there's more to playing the quarterback position than just covering and coverage, and so this is going to lead to some rankings that I personally disagree with, and a lot of people will as well. The results are still fine, but I do think that is a blind spot with my model's quarterback rankings, and something that you have to keep in mind. But still, I think the model is solid and worth looking at. Quarterback 1 in this year's draft, according to my model, is Quinyon Mitchell, who has a score of 98. Quinyon Mitchell, very good prospect, was elite in coverage in college, is an elite athlete, and is expected to be a first-round pick. That's a great prospect. So it's clear to see why he ranks so high in my model. Number 2, we have Cooper DeJean with a score of 97. Wasn't as good in coverage in college as Quinyon Mitchell, but he was still great in coverage. He's an amazing athlete, tested very well at his pro day. He's likely going to be a first-round pick. He may end up being a safety long-term, but still, he's a very good prospect. I like him a lot. Even as a safety, I think he's worth a pretty high pick. I'm a big fan of his. And then we got Nate Wiggins with a score of 92. I like Nate Wiggins. I don't love him. And it's because, me personally, I care a lot about the fact that he can't provide run support, and he also can't tackle. And he's skinny. That matters a lot to me. He is a good athlete who was great in coverage in college, but the fact that he's so skinny and just lacks physicality, that matters a lot, and it means that he isn't going to fit in a lot of different schemes in the NFL. So for me, Nate Wiggins would be more like corner 5 in this year's class than corner 3, which is where my model has him. But I do like him. I know I spent a lot of time here critiquing his game. I do think he is a good prospect, very good, but he does have some major weaknesses in his game that are not factoring into my model because I'm using it to kind of predict approximate value, or that's the metric that it's tied to. At number 4, we have Kool-Aid McKinstry with a score of 91. Had a 90 coverage score in college. Not a great athlete, only a 44 in athletic score, which is below average. I like Kool-Aid McKinstry a lot. His coverage numbers were awesome. The underwhelming athleticism does worry me a little bit, but man, he's a skilled player. I like him a lot. I think he's going to be a first-round pick. I'm expecting him to be a first-round selection. I would take him in the first round. I think he's pretty good, and my model does as well. After him, we have Terrion Arnold. The reason why he is low in the model, and his pre-draft score is 89. The reason why he is a bit low is because his coverage numbers weren't great. His coverage score is 53, which is just average. Now, he was a good athlete. Like, his athleticism score is 71. He tested very well at the combine. And he is an amazing run defender and tackler. He's got a lot of physicality in his game, which is a lot different than Nate Wiggins. And he's very young. And because of that, because he has such good size, because he's so physical in the run game and as a tackler, and because he's athletic, I like him a good bit, and I'm willing to overlook his underwhelming coverage numbers, and I think there's a chance that he can improve in coverage at the next level. But that is a weakness in his game, and it's why I do not think he belongs in the cornerback 1 discussion, at least in my opinion, and my model would agree. Now after him, we have Kamari Lassiter from Georgia. Amazing in coverage in college, but he's not a great athlete. In fact, he is a bad athlete. His athleticism score was 22. That's a major concern for me, and I am pretty low on him relative to my model. After him, we've got Chris Abrams, Drain from Missouri, was good in coverage in college. Again, like Lassiter, was a pretty bad, is a bad athlete or had a bad athleticism score. Is better than Lassiter, but not great, and that's why his score was just 71. Now, after those guys, there are a few guys in the 60s. Renardo Green at 62. I like him a lot. Great in coverage. Above average athlete. I think he's a very good prospect. Then we got TJ Tampa, and then Chow Smith Wade. And after those guys, we got a few guys in the 50s, like Kyrie Jackson, who was great in coverage and an above average athlete in college. I think something holding him and Renardo Green back is I believe off the top of my head, both of those guys are a bit old. I think they're older prospects, but still, the production profiles were good for those guys. And then you got, after Kyrie Jackson, Mike Sainristil with a score of 53, and Enos Rickstraw with a score of 51. And I don't know if I mentioned the scores for the other guys here. Kyrie Jackson had a score of 54. Chow Smith Wade had a score of 60. And TJ Tampa had a score of 61. My model likes the quarterback class a lot, and I do as well. I think it's pretty loaded. There's a lot of talented guys here, especially at the top. The top of the quarterback group is extremely strong. I like the quarterback group a lot, and so does my model. Now let's move on to safeties, and this is going to be the last position group we look at for on today's episode. We're going to finish by looking at the safeties, and for this position group, the production score is broken up into run defense, tackling, and coverage, which is different than the cornerback group, where for the cornerback model, it only looks at coverage. For the safety model, it expands the production score and looks at run defense, tackling, and coverage. Now, it doesn't take into account athletic testing because by my numbers, that actually didn't really matter all that much. The correlation wasn't very strong. But it does look at, I'm pretty sure that my pre-draft score looks at BMI because that did show some pretty strong correlation for safeties. I'm pretty sure that's factored into the pre-draft score. For this year's safety class, the number one safety by my model is Javon Bullard, who had an exceptional pre-draft score of 98, which is elite. He was very good. He was above average as a run defender in college, great as a tackler, and elite in coverage, which is awesome. He also is an above average athlete, which is good to see. And I think let's look at his BMI. His BMI was above average, so that's good to see. At number 2, there's a big drop-off. You got Cameron Kitchens with a score of 72. I think the thing carrying his pre-draft score is his consensus ranking and his BMI, because his production profile is a little bit below average all across the board. After Kitchens, you have Cole Bishop with a score of 65. He was great in coverage, so you like to see that. After him, you got Tyke Smith with a score of 64. He was elite in coverage in college. I wonder if he's getting bumped down due to his BMI. That might be hurting him. No, his BMI was awesome. Maybe it's his consensus ranking. Yeah, his consensus ranking was 131, which is holding him back a little bit. But that coverage score is very nice. You like to see that. Next, you got Kalen Bullock with a score of 61. He rounds out all the safeties in this class with a score in the 60s. There's 2 guys in this class with a score in the 50s. You have Kaiton Oladapo and Tyler Newman. Oladapo has a score of 59, and Tyler Newman has a score of 52. Newman just doesn't have a very strong production profile. Oladapo does, though. His run defense score was 71, his tackling score was 69, and his coverage score was 88, which is nice to see. I'm sure for him, the thing holding his score back is his consensus ranking, and that is, as he has a consensus ranking of 154, which is a bit low. My model doesn't like the safety class all that much, and I would tend to agree. I think the safety class it's not that great. I do like Javon Bullard, though, and my model loves him, likes him a lot. I think he's a pretty good prospect, and honestly, might be worth a late first-round pick. That might be a hot take, but I like Bullard a lot, and my model does as well. But yeah, that pretty much wraps up all the things I wanted to talk about with my model. So those are the results of my model for every prospect or every position group in the 2024 NFL Draft. I know we didn't look at every single individual prospect. That would take a long time because I do have a lot of prospects in my database. But yeah, I hope y'all enjoyed the results. I hope y'all found them interesting. Y'all may disagree with a lot of the rankings. I know I do in some places, but hopefully you found this informative and useful. I would love to hear your thoughts on social media. Hit me up on Twitter at @RyanMcCrary. That's VRyanMCCRary. I'd love to hear your thoughts over there. But yeah, that's all I have for today's episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. And I will see y'all next time. Peace.